Hey! Today we're going to be discussing some popular fashion history myths and misconceptions and dispelling some of those and perhaps even confirming others. We'll just have to wait and see. This is a topic I gauged interest on a little while ago and people seemed into it, so I thought it'd be fun to go over. I would be happy to do a video kind of debunking those myths as well as any other fashion history myths, so sound off and I will do it.
That is a threat. I will do it.
As for my qualifications, in case anyone is curious, I do have a master's degree in art history, dress and textile histories. I'm a fashion historian. I'm also a vintage collector. And while I can conduct research and I do know some things, I'm certainly not the end all be all. I always encourage people to go and prosper, do your own research. I'll be linking sources as always, and definitely recommend delving into any of these topics further if you're curious. We'll be covering the most common myths I see perpetuated either through films, literature, word of mouth, or on TikTok. But I'm really trying to not make this video like 3 hours long. So hopefully this can act as an accessible general kind of overview. There's just a lot of confusion out there, so maybe discussing these can make way for more meaningful and important conversations in fashion history moving forward, but again, who knows? We'll have to see. Was this portrait of Marie Antoinette in a chemise dress responsible for slavery? Short answer, no. Long answer is nuanced, so let's get into it. In 1873, Elisabeth Louise Vigée-Lebrun painted Marie Antoinette wearing a chemise à la reine, or reine en Gaul, henceforth the Gaul. I'm not saying all that again. The depiction of her loose-fitting white muslin dress with a simple ribbon and ruffled neckline was, to the public, reminiscent of a chemise or shift, which was the first layer of dress worn closest to the skin by women at the time.
The chemise was the garment worn next to the skin. It was made from linen, was washable, and was changed as frequently as possible.
In stark contrast to the elaborate 18th century Rococo fashions of vibrant printed silks and structured silhouettes, the Gaul was shocking. Yes, people thought the queen had been painted in her underwear. The portrait's display at the Académie Royale led to scandal, with some demanding its removal. Despite the criticism, the Gaul gained popularity among elite circles. The queen's personal retreat, that is the Hameau de la Reine at the Petit Trianon in Versailles, further fueled controversy. This was her little cottagecore escape where she and her ladies emulated a pastoral lifestyle, which many aristocrats interpreted as a rejection of court traditions and an exclusion of their access to the queen. This very romanticized pastoral sentiment expanded to Britain, which hosted a similar trend of elite women cosplaying as working women. See the white apron trend? Notable figures like Lady Elizabeth Foster and her friend Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, adopted the style, the latter even reportedly being gifted a Gaul from the queen herself. In the following decades, the Gaul influenced a broader shift in fashion. Post-revolutionary France saw a departure from the ostentatious styles of the Ancien Régime, and in its place rose a callback to classical antiquity, with simple dress-down Grecian and Roman-inspired styles becoming central to the Napoleonic and Regency eras, marking a significant change in fashion. So the idea is that the white muslin gown trend created demand that bolstered the global cotton trade, fueling both industrial expansion and the transatlantic slave trade. The rise of cotton at the expense of French silk production also heightened anxieties about Klaus.
I'm the hybrid!
The rise of cotton at the expense of French silk production also heightened anxieties about class boundaries, as muslin was seen as an inferior textile that blurred the lines between the aristocracy and commoners. The argument linking Marie Antoinette's Gaul portrait to the expansion of American slavery through a butterfly effect is intriguing, but relies on a series of speculative assumptions. It posits that this scandalized portrait of the queen in a cotton gown ignited a chain reaction that fueled global demand for cotton, accompanying innovations in cotton production, such as the cotton gin, directly contributing to the staggering increase of slavery in the United States. While it's true that the Queen's adoption of muslin gowns helped popularize the trend, she didn't invent it. Demand for cotton textiles already had deep roots predating this portrait. The first industrial revolution, European colonial expansion, and the growing obsession with classical antiquity, fueled by the second discovery of Pompeii, for example, were more significant drivers. Cotton was already a highly popular material before the 1780s. By the early 18th century, imported cotton textiles were so sought after in Europe that Britain passed the Calico Acts, which banned most finished cotton goods to protect domestic industries. In the mid-18th century, significant advancements in cotton processing, such as mechanized spinning, for example, the spinning jenny, the water frame, and the spinning mule, had already been made in Britain. Restrictions on cotton were lifted in the 1770s, causing cotton sales to surge. By 1784, cotton made up at least 40% of British exports, with France as a key importer. The appeal of cotton lay in its affordability and versatility, which helped it gain traction as a cheaper alternative to luxury textiles. Additionally, cotton was already used for undergarments, accessories, and even in high-quality printed fabrics in Europe. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 revolutionized cotton processing and made large-scale cotton farming highly profitable. The global demand for cotton textiles coincided with these developments, but did not hinge on any single event, even one as culturally impactful as Marie Antoinette's scandalous Gall portrait. Moreover, the expansion of slavery in the United States was tied to economic, agricultural, colonial, and of course, systemically racist factors. Attributing the rise of the American slavery complex to Marie Antoinette's dress simply oversimplifies history. The ripple effect theory is a bit reductive and places undue weight on a single factor while ignoring the broader economic, industrial, and cultural contexts. That said, it is certainly important to acknowledge how intertwined elite fashions and global trade were with labor exploitation. This is an interconnectedness that unfortunately exists across many products and trends throughout history. So now moving forward into the early 19th century with the Empire era in France and the Regency era if you're in Britain, we must now ask if women were actually dampening their dresses to make them more revealing or to appear like a Greek statue. And further, was this cotton muslin dress trend responsible for mass illness? So no doubt there were prevailing anxieties over this emerging silhouette and the cotton from which it was made. The neoclassical inspired look was a lot more dressed down and was certainly scandalized at the time. There are very famous contemporary satirical prints mocking women's fashion, like Parisian ladies in their winter dress for 1800, another being the Graces in a High Wind. These depict some fashionable ladies who are quite exposed and not at all prepared for the elements. Obviously, satire is an exaggeration. It's not meant to be taken literally, but they're making fun of the more revealing dress of the time and the risks that women would take in order to be considered fashionable. But despite being ridiculed for wearing more revealing clothing, women would have still worn proper undergarments. This would have included a chemise, stays, and petticoats. In colder weather, that would have included heavier textiles like cashmere or flannel, and of course, the appropriate outerwear. There was no short supply of shawls, scarves, cloaks, hooded capes, redingotes, pelisses, gloves, hats, fur trim, you name it. So any women, if at all, who chose to wear thin clothing despite the weather were obviously chastised for it. As far as women actually dampening their dresses in order to make them more revealing or like a Greek statue, which would, to be clear, slay. I'm gonna call BS, unfortunately. It just doesn't make sense that a fashionable woman would risk her place in society by doing such a thing. I mean, the scandal this would cause. I'm sure this myth stemmed from the same sentiment as depicted by the satirists, just another facetious way of ridiculing women for this anxiety-inducing silhouette. It is possible that some French women may have worn nude stockings underneath to mimic flesh, but I think that's as close as we're going to get with that one. Okay, so what about muslin disease? 19th century medical journals and antiquarians have famously and erroneously allocated the cause of a myriad of illnesses and diseases to women's fashion. More on that later. It would appear that this is the same thing that happened here with women's cotton muslin dresses. Dress historian Hilary Davidson, who wrote Dress in the Age of Jane Austen, took to Twitter a few years ago to kind of dispelled this myth and sought to find out where it may have originated.
Dead naming people? Eh. Dead naming Twitter?
There is a 1909 publication called Modes and Manners of the 19th Century, etc., which makes explicit reference to muslin disease, and it seems that a lot of other sources pull directly from this. However, there is a contemporary Munich journal from 1807 wherein, quote, a doctor in northern Germany warns against a new disease which in varying forms threatens the fair sex with death and doom. He calls it the muslin disease. As I just bit my mic by accident. Getting hungry, apparently. So, as established, women were not walking around in damp dresses or barely nude. But due to prevailing anxieties about women's dress and how it may affect their health, it's fairly understandable how physicians might blame, say, an outbreak of influenza on this new scandalized silhouette that, by comparison, was thinner and more revealing than ever before. Did Victorians actually think tuberculosis was hot? Looks maxing with disease. Yeah. Unfortunately, in the 18th and 19th centuries, literal tuberculosis had a significant influence on and reflected women's beauty standards and fashion. Carolyn A. Day dubbed this phenomenon consumptive chic in her book on the topic, which I would highly recommend. Yes, before there was heroin chic, there was consumptive chic. Way back before the days of antibiotics, there was a pervasive belief that the disease was more rampant amongst artists with a sensitive constitution. Sentimentalism was a popular philosophy at the time, which reinforced a belief system that outward beauty was reflective of inner goodness. So one could actually be too good to live, which was a sentiment that especially applied to these artistic types as well as women and children. To quote an excerpt from 1854 clinical literature, selfishness and hardness of character less frequently present themselves in persons susceptible to this form of disease. Therefore, the more beautiful you are, the more goodness you have inside of you, and thus the more susceptible you are to diseases like consumption. Contemporary medical treatises reveal a preoccupation with the loveliness and goodness of these women afflicted, using terms like slight, ethereal, and delicate, no doubt thanks to illness-induced weight loss. Doctors made note of their clear, pale complexions, flushed lips and cheeks, wide, sparkling eyes, brimmed with dark, luxurious lashes, as well as flowing, glossy hair, as though these traits were somehow relevant medical observations. Henry Gilbert's 1842 medical treatise, Pulmonary Consumption, became almost poetic, describing the disease, quote, with step as noiseless as the summer air, who comes in beautiful decay, her eyes dissolve with a feverish glow of light, and on her cheeks a rosy tint, as if the tip of beauty's finger faintly pressed it there. Alas! Consumption is her name. Of course, these perceived beautiful characteristics of consumption were directly caused by fever, loss of appetite, and coughing up blood. The imagined gorgeousness that consumption brought upon its victims reflected long-held beauty standards of the time.
Wide, sparkling, dilated eyes, again, the result of that low-grade fever. The medical references also speak to having white teeth, dilated pupils, and fringed, dark, luxurious eyelashes. And these are the medical descriptions of the disease, not ones in beauty manuals. Now, as descriptions of the ideal feminine form in the 19th century tend to bear a striking similarity to those provided by tuberculosis, the accounts of these symptoms provide a glimpse as to why this disease beautified as it destroyed.
There were beauty pamphlets that actually advised how you could get the look by means of cosmetics, but most advised cautiously to not overdo it. In her book, Tuberculosis and the Victorian Literary Imagination, Catherine Byrne argues that later Victorian-style corsets aided and abetted extreme thinness. Medical professionals who first spread beliefs that consumption was being spread by the long trailing skirts of the early Regency period would later blame women's corsets in the Victorian era. More on that later. Day suggests that the exaggerated silhouette with its lower necklines, deep backs, cinched waist, accentuated protruding collarbones, shoulder blades, and tiny waists, likely reflecting and contributing to the fetishization of frail, ill women.
The drop-shouldered style also forces a round-shouldered conformation, and in doing so emulates the physical silhouette of the consumptive female. Sentimental dress also emphasizes delicacy and restricts movement and gesture just as the illness did. This is actually a sentimental corset, and it forces your shoulder blades to pop up and above the top of the corset, so you get that forcing of the wing-backed appearance. The corset and form of dress, as I said, sort of created this stooped posture that was natural in women who had consumption, and one that was actually believed to create the disease. So that stooping was actually thought to be something that could cause consumption.
One of the most telling and, frankly, saddest quotes of the psyche of this era is from 1849, when Charlotte Bronte, having lost 5 siblings herself to the disease, said, "Consumption, I am aware, is a flattering malady." This statement encapsulates the deadly and pervasive grasp tuberculosis had on society, blending tragedy with a truly disturbing aesthetic ideal. All right, now, did Hugo Boss design the Nazi uniforms? This is another no, but yes, with the confusion largely stemming from pop history, more or less. So the company was founded in 1924 in Germany by Hugo Ferdinand Boss and originally produced ready-made men's clothing. Hugo Boss, the man, was a German businessman and early member of the Nazi Party, having been an active member from 1931 on. In the early 1930s, Hugo Boss began to produce and supply military uniforms for the regime, which boosted their sales greatly. One of his first big contracts was to supply brown shirts. By 1938, the firm was producing army uniforms, and eventually it was manufacturing for the Waffen-SS too. And who exactly was manufacturing these uniforms, you ask? Forced laborers. Yeah, so from April 1940, Hugo Boss used forced laborers, mostly women, from German-occupied territories and prisoner of war camps to manufacture uniforms for the SS and later the Wehrmacht. After the war, Boss sought to argue that he had only joined the party in order to save his company, and no, unlike some other contemporaries who directly benefited and profited from the Nazi regime, of which there are many, Hugo Boss did face legal consequences for his affiliations. He was classified as a follower of Nazism in the denazification proceedings. Is that what it's called? Yeah, in the denazification proceedings, and he was fined and essentially temporarily banned from running his business. He died shortly thereafter in 1948 of a tooth abscess. But the company recovered, turning its focus to men's suits, and would become the luxury brand we know today. In 2011, Hugo Boss commissioned an independent study into its wartime activities, apologizing for its use of forced labor and ties to the Third Reich. So TLDR, Hugo Boss did not design the Nazi uniforms. Rather, his company was contracted as one of the firms involved in manufacturing them via the use of forced labor from civilians of Nazi-occupied territories and POWs, who were, again, mostly women. The actual designs for the Nazi uniforms and SS logo are credited to SS officer Karl Diebitsch, I think is how you say it, and Walter Heck, a graphic designer. So I think the myth surrounding Hugo Boss and the Nazis' uniforms comes from basically just conflating designing with manufacturing. But yeah, they were certainly directly involved. If there's a slightly different looking camera angle and or a slightly different looking me, just ignore that. Truth be told, I finished recording that first part at 2:30 a.m. and I could not possibly will myself to continue. So here we are again.
My necklace al memeo.
Daddy, I hate you. Brother, I need you. Lover, hate you. I can see it.
This next one is corsets. That's it. That's the myth. So were corsets truly these restrictive patriarchal death traps as depicted by basically every period drama ever? There she is, a young woman holding onto her bedpost for dear life whilst her servant, mother, or even husband straps her into this torture device, limiting her movement, preventing her breathing, and even rearranging her organs.
Because nobody admits anything they've done! Even over coffee from a pot, none of you want to touch! You're gonna fucking die! What the fuck am I supposed to do, huh? Fuck your fucking family! What do you want me to do?
Oh, the horror. To preface this entry, I just want to say that logically, a garment so ubiquitous as the corset that is supposedly so dangerous wouldn't have lasted for centuries. Right? Also, this isn't to suggest that corsets have never had any negative impacts on anyone whatsoever, but there are many varied myths laced into its history. Pun intended, it's in the script.
Also, men wore corsets too. Oh my god.
There's a lot to unpack here, so strap in or lace down. That was another pun. It's in the, yeah, you get it. Historically, the main function of structural undergarments, such as pairs of bodies, stays, and corsets, I'll discuss the differences between these a bit later, was to provide support while helping shape the desired fashionable silhouette. Not too different than modern support garments in that sense. Fashionable silhouettes have always been achieved via an illusion through multiple garments throughout history. Hoops, farthingales, panniers, crinolines, bustles, stays, and corsets were all foundational articles used to manipulate the silhouette. Corsets were worn by women and some men across all social classes throughout the life cycle, meaning they had to be practical for both daily laborers as well as the wealthy elite. As a result, corsets were designed to allow for movement and breathing, with wearers adjusting their lacing to suit their needs. If a corset leaves you gasping for air, it's either an improper fit or it's laced far too tightly.
I didn't have a leaning board, but I would just like a couch like this. I would
Because you
set just like
cannot
that.
sit down. I mean,
You
it's-
really can't, and honestly, like women existed in that for such a long time, which does give you a lot of sympathy for that time period, what you were going through. But for the first month, I couldn't breathe. And Sandy Powell is the costume designer. She's fantastic. The costumes are beautiful. There's just this one part. It's historically accurate, but I couldn't fucking breathe.
It's also crucial to remember that corsets were custom fitted to the wearer's form, unlike, say, the Amazon corset that had TikTok in a chokehold back in 2020. You know the one. Corsets historically were tailor-made to an individual and properly fitted. They also weren't worn directly on the skin. Let's do a general history of corsetry and get some definitions going, because I think that a lot of the misconceptions come from people not really understanding what corsetry is or how it came to be. Before the 16th century, there were types of bodied kirtles that could provide support, but they weren't boned. I don't know why I just said it like that. Boned. But they, whoa. Boning describes materials such as baleen, cane, and reed that are used to shape and hence bone a garment structure. These materials are stiff yet flexible to varying degrees, allowing the garments to mold themselves to the body of the wearer. Boned support garments first emerge at the end of the 16th century, that is the late 1500s during the Elizabethan era. And no, Catherine de' Medici was not enforcing metal corsets at court. They were utilized in order to help create the fashionable bodice shape, which, as you will see here, is this very elongated conical torso, and they were not concerned with cinching the waist. The term pair of bodies comes from the French cotte de jupe, essentially body skirt or like a boned petticoat. Bodies often included sleeves that could be attached at the shoulders with laces or ribbon. When it comes to such garments in the 16th and 17th centuries, the line between under and outerwear was less defined than it was in later periods. Smooth covered stays, for instance, were ubiquitous throughout the 17th century, that is the 1600s, and they were worn with a type of open gown, allowing for the decorative portion portion of the stays to be visible. In the 17th century, pairs of bodies and stays could have been used interchangeably. Fashion historian Sarah Bendel notes that stays was not really used in historical documentation until about the 1680s, a la Randall Holmes's 1688 manual, which is where we get the distinction between smooth and
Stitched.
stays as well. The term stays previously had described the stiffening used in undergarments and other articles, but not the garments themselves. By the 1700s, coinciding with the advent of the mantua, more distinctive differences between bodies and stays emerged. While stays are the main event as far as 18th century undergarments are concerned, in the early 18th century, pairs of bodies were still around. Incidents of theft, of all things, are quite useful here, as we see the frequently described bodice and pair of bodice, which continues until declining around the 1730s. There's also other manuscripts and journals and magazines and etc. I would now like to introduce you to Petronella. She is an 18th century boned pair of bodies from the Glasgow Object Handling Collection, upon which I had the absolute pleasure of conducting an object analysis in grad school. I miss you, Petronella. Her construction, which was fairly heavily boned, I counted 45 boning channels, would have likely been made from baleen. This particular garment is made of this beige-colored French silk with floral-themed brocading. She's made up of 10 separate panels that are stitched together and 2 main bodies laced together, with the sleeves attached via 4 surviving ribbons. There are metal eyelet holes as well, later grommets meant for front and back lacing. In my analysis, I compared Miss Petronella to several similar extant objects, which I will also show on screen so you get an idea. So into the 18th century, as bodies began to disappear and lose prominence, these smooth-covered stays, why is that such a tongue twister, were still these visible decorative pieces that were meant for formal wear. Eventually, stays transitioned into the heavily boned structural hidden undergarments we most closely associate with the term. 18th century stays often featured adjustable shoulder straps and lacing. Again, stays were not designed to reduce waist size, and they really didn't manipulate the body at all. Their primary function was to provide support, create a smooth foundation for garments to lie neatly, and to shape the silhouette through strategic boning placement, which, as you can see, was wider at the top and, again, more conical through the torso. So the stays themselves provided the shape. The body was not shaped by the stays. Does that make sense? I don't know. It makes sense in my head. Corsets also existed in the 18th century, which often featured cording instead of boning. Into the 19th century, with the regency / empire / federalist eras and the more relaxed neo-Grecian look that we discussed earlier, these soft corsets provided support via cording and often a busk, which was inserted in the middle front of the garment. Side note on busks, there was actually a really sweet courtship practice of inscribing and decorating busks and giving them to a lover, and it's really cute because you would wear them close to your chest, and I think that's the sweetest thing ever. I don't know, it's kind of a dream of mine for someone to gift me a busk in that way. I don't want you to rizz me up, I want you to gift me a busk, okay? So these corsets were specifically designed to complement the looser, softer look, which is why that scene in season 1, episode 1 of Bridgerton makes absolutely no sense. I know this has been probably discussed to death at this point, but it still irks me. Why? Corsets and stays were starting to be used interchangeably until about the mid-1800s, when corsets really just took over. The construction of corsetry evolved alongside the vast technological advancements of this period. Whereas stays were once hand-stitched and hand-bound, industrialization allowed corsets to be mass-produced. Corsets also became less heavily boned, lending way to a garment that was able to actually manipulate the body, allowing it to adhere to the shifting fashionable silhouette and the era's evolving beauty standards. Tight lacing capabilities did not become prevalent in corsets until about the 1840s to 1850s, which, if you'll recall back to that consumptive chic era, checks out. It's imperative to note that tight lacing and corsetry are not synonymous. Tight lacing refers to a specific practice of extreme waist reduction reproduction, whereas corsetry encompasses this broader range of garments designed to provide support, shape, and structure. Indeed, tight lacing was an optional and not all that widespread trend. In fact, it was actually rare and quite shocking. The women and some men who practiced tight lacing were highly criticized for it. There's also no specific measurements that constitute tight lacing, but Victorian and Edwardian era corsets could allow one to lace down to 1 to 3 inches depending on the construction of the corset and also the wearer themselves. You'll see references in medical journals and magazines to like 20-inch waists or even the fabled 16-inch waist. Oh yes, let the mythology resume. Let's start with the fact that there is no evidence to suggest surgically removing ribs to achieve a smaller waist during the 19th century. That wasn't a thing. But the doctors said, yeah, they said a lot of shit. Although male physicians of the era criticized corsetry and blamed it for a variety of ailments, as we've discussed, it's important to recognize that these same doctors often promoted misconceptions about women's health, such as the notion of female hysteria. In the 19th century, the belief that the uterus was suspended by tiny little strings had been abandoned, but the concept of the wandering womb persisted. It was thought that the uterus could move freely within the body, causing a variety of ailments in women. This idea was closely tied to the condition known as hysteria, with the displaced uterus blamed for symptoms like emotional instability, physical pain, and mental disturbances. Consequently, many women's health complaints were attributed to this belief, with corsetry often cited as a contributing factor. This led to problematic treatments aimed at correcting the uterus's position. Lack of understanding on basic female anatomy, my how far we've come. This just in, President-elect Donald Trump appoints male Victorian physician to head the Department of Health. I couldn't resist. Also, the real-life examples they often used were frequently women who had pre-existing, unrelated medical conditions that persisted irrespective of their corsets. And yet we still cherry-pick unfounded claims of corsetry causing broken ribs and shifting organs from these medical journals and submit them as fact to fit the modern-day narrative of oppressive corsetry. For instance, there is the familiar trope of women fainting due to corsetry, but these instances are frequently drawn from fictional works wherein swooning actually served as a literary device. Okay, but what about the fainting couches? The idea that 19th century women were consistently fainting and needed special couches to collapse onto is another modern myth. What we now call fainting couches were actually referred to as simply daybeds. I know, not nearly as dramatic. These were low-lying neo-Grecian sofas that were not actually designed with fainting in mind. In fact, the phrase fainting couch didn't appear until well after the Victorian era. In reality, it's challenging to attribute fainting specifically to corsetry at all, especially when more plausible causes like, general health issues were prevalent at the time. Okay, but I said some people did tight lace, so what about this 16-inch waist? Valerie Steele's extensive research into corsetry found that the waist size of extant objects wasn't all too different from many modern-day women's sizes. In multiple collections, such as Colonial Williamsburg, the smallest pair of stays has a waist of 24 inches, with the largest often being more than 30 inches. The Symington collection of the Leicestershire Museum Service indicates that out of 197 corsets, only one measured 18 inches, 11 were 19 inches, and most fell between 20 to 26 inches. Doris Langley Moore's incredible collection of period dresses belonging to young women of that period averaged at a 24-inch waist as well. So with a few outliers, the majority of surviving 18th and 19th century corsets range from 24 to 30 inches, which is within range of many women today. Also, again, lacing down a corset involves reducing the natural waist size 1 to 3 inches, so the estimated natural waist size of the wearer can be increased by that much. This is a good time to address another myth. Were people just so much smaller back then? While humans have been getting increasingly taller throughout all of time, it's not true that there was a search party for the waist of every woman in the past. This is basically just survivorship bias. Oftentimes, an object that has survived was only able to be worn for a short period of time due to a variety of factors. Perhaps it was worn for a certain occasion, it was preserved for a sentimental reason, or the wearer was a young person who simply grew out of it and didn't have it altered to fit later on, on or have it passed down. Well-preserved extant objects are frequently quite small and not well worn. They're not always an accurate representation of the average person or even the wearer themselves. Were heels originally designed for men? You betcha. For much of history, it was the men who laid the house down. Boots. Heels were originally associated with men for much of history. Their earliest known use dates back to the 10th century when Persian cavalry wore heeled footwear to better secure their feet in stirrups while horseback riding. This particular function was later adapted into European fashion during the 17th century, particularly in the French court, where high heels became a symbol of status and authority for elite men. At the time, fashion placed significant emphasis on the legs and the feet, and heels were seen as a way to enhance and display these features. Women of the court eventually adopted heeled shoes, seeking to emulate the prestige associated with them, and then they were sexualized for wearing them, because of course they were. After which, the men abandoned heels for more practical, flatter boots. By the 19th century, women of all classes wore heeled shoes, so I don't know, it wasn't until fairly recently that heels became primarily associated with women, despite how firmly entrenched that perception is today. So many layers, how hot and uncomfortable. How did people of the past not die of heat stroke in the summer? This is another one where I'm like, they weren't stupid. Historically, people have dressed pragmatically for the weather. Just as we discussed how Regency women weren't walking around half naked in the cold, people throughout history weren't wearing hot and heavy layers in the heat. Natural breathable textiles like linen, for instance, aren't insulating and can be quite cooling and absorbent even with the body fully covered. That 100% polyester shirt from insert fast fashion website, not so much. And don't take it from me, there are plenty of historical interpreters who will tell you that they're quite comfortable even in the summer heat. Also, the climate was different, especially depending where we're talking. I mean, I used to live in Scotland and the weather was incredibly mild even in the summer, and that was a couple years ago. The clothing seen in historical portraits and photographs can also be misleading. Formal portraiture often featured layers of sumptuous silks and velvet to project wealth and status, and sitting for a photograph, people would dress up for that as well, as it was a special occasion. It's time to discuss crinolines. First of all, how did they sit down? If we look at the garment's construction, these pieces were made from flexible channels placed horizontally, which allowed for mobility while also holding the garment's shape. So you could just lift your skirt a little and sit. You've heard of bend and snap. Now get ready for lift and sit. They were actually invented to eliminate the endless layering of petticoats to achieve the fashionable silhouette. Instead, you could wear less skirts over your crinoline and still look like the floofy, funnel-shaped poof of your dreams. Oh, you were wondering about the other thing, the crinoline fires? Well, it's always important to critically assess primary sources. 19th century newspapers often exaggerated or even fabricated statistics, like the claim that in
1860.
3,000 women died annually from their skirts catching fire. I mean, I know it happens sometimes, but 3,000? These stories were often intended as morality tales, highlighting the perceived dangers of vanity, which is a common theme throughout this video if you couldn't tell. Crinolines were also satirized to death. However, some women did tragically die due to their skirts immolating, and some of those cases were directly or indirectly caused by the apparatus. The crinoline did make for a wide, albeit light and airy design, and the skirts it supported, as well as the crinoline itself, were often made from flammable materials. A lot of people cite the Archduchess Matilda of Austria, who died in 1867 when her skirt caught fire, but do note that this was likely due to a lit cigarette she was holding. Other notable figures, such as Oscar Wilde's half-sisters, Mary and Emma Wilde, both tragically died from third-degree burns after one of their skirts caught on fire from a candlestick. It is such a sad story. So yeah, I'm not saying that this never happened, but it is often exaggerated and cited as like an epidemic, which I don't think that was the case. We certainly can't investigate each case of the presumed thousands that occurred. And in a lot of these cases, it seems that it wasn't the crinoline responsible, but more the fact that clothing tends to be flammable. I want to end on the idea that fashion historically has been a trickle-down system as popularized by sociologists like Thorstein Veblen and later elaborated by George Simmel and John Flugel. The idea suggests that fashion begins with the upper classes and gradually trickles down to lower classes. In this model, elite tastes are imitated by the middle and working classes until the upper class abandons the trend for something new, thus reinforcing this cycle of social hierarchy. However, this framework has been widely critiqued for oversimplifying the complexity of fashion's evolution, particularly when viewed through the lens of gender, race, and cross-cultural influences. Lou Taylor highlights how early theories of fashion were predominantly rooted in the perspectives of men in sociology and anthropology. They often overlooked or dismissed clothing as a serious subject of study, leading to gender biases in their conclusions as well. Actually, fashion history wasn't even really considered a serious discipline until fairly recently. In grad school, I did a work placement that was centered around the pioneers of fashion history, and it was so fascinating. I'll leave some of those sources below as well. Such dismissals reinforce the idea that serious cultural production comes from men or Western high culture rather than the everyday dress practices of women or non-Western societies. In reality, fashion is far more dynamic than the trickle-down model allows. Trickle-up trends have existed throughout history where lower class or marginalized groups influence elite fashion. In this video, we've already discussed instances of trickle-up trends. Marie Antoinette and her ladies emulating laboring women. I briefly referenced the white apron trend, wherein elite British women of the 18th century adopted white aprons, which were a staple of working class dress as part of a broader romanticization of pastoral life. There are ceaseless examples of fashion appropriated from other cultures through colonization,
1800s.
paisley print, 1910s Orientalism, or the countless cultural influences on, say, hippie fashion in the 1960s. This presents another issue in trickle-down framing, and that is its Western centrism. Early sociological theories of fashion often presented the West as the source of innovation and culture, with the rest, non-Western societies, framed as passive recipients of European fashion. All the while, non-Western textiles, motifs, and silhouettes have profoundly influenced European fashion design. Even today, appropriation of certain cultural dress is often repackaged as innovative by European and American designers, erasing their original source and context. There are also gendered assumptions embedded in the dated trickle-down model, which become clear when we consider how women's fashion has been framed as a lesser cultural production. In the 1980s, works like Adored in Dreams and Women in Fashion: A New Look critiqued the inherent gender biases in fashion theory that existed at the time. They challenged the view that fashion is simply a means of conspicuous consumption, which is Veblen's term, and they argued that women's dress practices deserve as much attention as, say, men's suits. The trickle-down system, when applied without nuance, reinforces the idea that women's dress serves only to signify status rather than being a legitimate source of personal, cultural, or political expression. See my video on face patches, gender, and socio-political identity in the 18th century. Basically, the trickle-down theory is reductive and exclusionary, and I hate that it is still perpetuated. The truth is, fashion history is a dynamic, cross-cultural, and multi-directional discipline that is inherently tied to the humanity of it all. All right, well, those are all the myths and misconceptions I have in me at the moment. I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts. I'm sure I missed plenty of popular ones, so maybe I'll do a part 2 at some point. But other than that, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for being here at all. This is almost my 1-year anniversary posting long form videos on YouTube, and I absolutely love it. I have so many other videos I want to cover. I really want to get into a more consistent schedule with posting, but I really appreciate you being here. And if you liked this video, I would also appreciate if you liked and subscribed and maybe left a respectful comment, and I will hope to see you in the next one. Okay, bye!